She hadn't said a word the entire flight. No uniform, no medals, just a sweatshirt, a quiet stare, and an aisle seat in economy. The Navy officers across from her had written her off as some mechanic, joking that she probably couldn't even fly a drone, let alone a jet. But when the storm closed in, turbulence slammed the cabin, and lightning cracked across the windows, the SEAL captain opened the cockpit door with a single question. Is there a combat pilot on board? She stood, and everything changed. Because the woman they dismissed wasn't just trained, she was the reason that plane didn't go down. The aircraft pushed back from the gate as afternoon storm clouds built like gray mountains on the horizon. Through her window, she watched the engines spool up, heard the familiar whine of turbines finding their rhythm, normal sounds, routine procedures, everything exactly as it should be. Around her, the cabin settled into that universal ritual of strangers learning to coexist in a metal tube. Overhead bins stuffed full, tray tables latched, phones switching to airplane mode with practiced efficiency, the kind of choreography that happened thousands of times a day across the world. But 3 rows behind her, 2 Navy officers were making sure everyone knew they were there. The problem with commercial aviation these days, one said, voice pitched just loud enough to carry, is they let anyone in the cockpit. Hell, half these airline pilots probably couldn't land a Cessna if the GPS went dark. His companion laughed, ice rattling in his plastic cup. Don't even get me started on military aviation. Army's full of support staff who think fixing helicopters makes them pilots, mechanics with pilot fantasies. The woman in 22C turned a page in her paperback, a dense technical manual about flight systems, margins filled with handwritten notes in precise block letters. She didn't look back, didn't react, just kept reading like she hadn't heard a word, but her pen had stopped moving across the page. The plane climbed through the cloud layers, cabin lights dimming for the long haul across the Atlantic. Around her, passengers dozed with blankets, screens flickered with movies. Flight attendants moved with practiced quiet, a standard 8-hour rhythm, nothing unusual. Except she wasn't really reading anymore. Her eyes kept drifting to the wing outside, following subtle changes in the metal's behavior, the way it flexed under load, the heat shimmer from the engine exhaust, small things that spoke in the language of stress, strain, and mechanical fatigue. Things that told stories most people couldn't hear. Behind her, the Navy officers were well into their second round of whiskey, voices growing bolder with each sip, intentionally louder. I bet half the people on this plane would claim they flew Black Hawks in Afghanistan, the louder one continued, gesturing with his plastic cup, just because they changed oil on one during basic training. His buddy snorted, ice rattling as he drained his drink. Paper pushers with Top Gun fantasies. That's what you get when the military goes soft. Everyone's a hero in their own mind. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. The businessman next to her cleared his throat and put in earbuds. An elderly woman rose up, gave them a disapproving look before returning to her magazine. But the officers weren't finished. The louder one leaned forward, voice carrying easily through the cabin. Hell, I bet that quiet little thing up there, he gestured vaguely in her direction, probably tells people she's military. Probably says she flew choppers or some nonsense. You can always tell the wannabes. They never say a word because they know they'll get called out. His companion laughed, the sound sharp and performative. Admin clerks and motor pool mechanics give them a uniform, and suddenly they're special ops in their LinkedIn profiles. The words hit the air like a physical thing. Several passengers glanced back and forth between the officers and her, uncomfortable tension spreading through nearby rows. A mother covered her young son's ears. The businessman beside her shifted further away, as if proximity might make him complicit. She closed her book quietly, marking the page with a worn boarding pass. Her reflection in the window showed no expression, just dark eyes that had seen things these two couldn't imagine. But she said nothing, did nothing, because she'd learned long ago that some conversations weren't worth joining, especially when responding would require explaining things like the Purple Heart in her footlocker back home, the classified after-action reports with her name on them, or the faces of pilots she'd pulled from burning cockpits who were alive today because she'd known exactly what to do when everything went to hell. and especially when the metal around her was starting to whisper things that mattered more than hurt feelings or wounded pride. The first sign came when most passengers were lost in movies or fitful sleep. A subtle change in the background hum that surrounded them, the thousand small sounds that meant everything was working as designed. She felt it before she heard it. A slight irregular rhythm in the port engine, buried beneath the steady drone of cruise flight. Not a skip exactly, more like a hesitation, the kind of thing you'd miss unless you'd spent years listening to turbines under stress. Her hand moved to the window, palm flat against the plastic. Through the glass, she could feel vibration patterns that didn't match what her ears were telling her. The wing was flexing normally, but something deeper was off. Then came the smell, faint, nearly invisible beneath the recycled air and cleaning solvents, but unmistakable to anyone who'd worked around aircraft electronics, hot insulation, overloaded circuits. The acrid tang of wiring pushed beyond its limits. She sat forward slightly, nostrils flaring like an animal testing the wind. Other passengers slept on, oblivious to the chemical signature drifting through the ventilation system. She'd smelled that exact scent in a Chinook over Helmand Province when the avionics panel started cooking itself, breathed it in an Apache that limped home on backup systems after taking small arms fire through the electronics bay. It meant something was dying in the walls. The lights flickered once, brief, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it. She was. Her eyes moved to the overhead panel, then to the air vents, cataloging details that would matter if things went sideways. Emergency equipment locations, structural stress points, the way other passengers were positioned relative to exits. Combat habits never really died, they just waited. The intercom crackled to life, the captain's voice calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. Nothing to be concerned about, but as a precaution, please return to your seats and keep seatbelts fastened." Minor technical difficulties, she'd heard that phrase before, usually right before someone started screaming orders and everything went to hell. The businessman next to her stirred, glancing around with the confused expression of someone pulled from deep sleep. "What's happening?" She didn't answer. Her attention was focused on sounds he couldn't interpret. The subtle change in engine harmonics, the way the airframe was responding to control inputs with microsecond delays that spoke of system strain, not turbulence, not weather. Something deeper, something structural. The second flicker lasted longer, long enough for entertainment screens to blink off and back on, long enough for murmurs to ripple through the cabin like static electricity. "Did you see that? What's wrong with the lights? I smell something burning." The woman in 22C unbuckled her seatbelt, not to panic, not to demand answers from flight attendants who wouldn't have them. She stood because 12 years of military training had taught her that when systems started failing, you got ready to act. The Navy officers behind her were suddenly alert, earlier bravado evaporating as the situation shifted from theoretical to real. "Hey," the louder one called to a passing flight attendant, "what kind of technical difficulties? That smell, is that electrical?" The attendant's smile was painted on. "Please remain seated, sir. The flight crew is handling the situation." But her eyes told a different story. They darted toward the cockpit door, then back to passengers who were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. The woman watched this exchange with the detached analysis of someone accustomed to reading stress patterns in people as well as machines. The attendant was scared, trying not to show it, but scared, which meant the crew was scared too. That's when she knew this wasn't going to end with an apologetic announcement and free drinks. The third power fluctuation killed half the cabin lights. Passengers bolted upright in their seats. Someone screamed. A baby started crying 3 rows back. The subtle chemical smell was stronger now, no longer masked by ventilation systems that were struggling to keep up. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice carried new urgency, carefully controlled but impossible to miss. "We are working through some system irregularities. Flight crew, please prepare for possible emergency procedures." Emergency procedures, the words hung in the recycled air like smoke, transforming routine discomfort into something that tasted like fear. Around her, passengers were whispering frantically, checking their phones for signal, gripping armrests with white knuckles, the kind of collective anxiety that spread through crowds when people realized they were no longer in control of their circumstances. But she remained calm, not because she wasn't afraid anyone with sense would be afraid, but because panic was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. In Kandahar, when the Taliban put an RPG through their rotor hub and they'd auto-rotated into a dry riverbed with no hydraulics and fuel leaking like blood, in Syria, when they'd taken heavy fire during extract and limped home on one engine with half the avionics dark, fear was information, nothing more. And right now, that information was telling her to get ready. The cockpit door opened. That alone was enough to drop the cabin into dead silence. Commercial airline cockpits didn't open during flight unless something was seriously wrong. Passengers craned their necks, trying to see past the galley bulkhead where flight attendants huddled in urgent conversation. The man who stepped through wasn't tall, but he carried himself with the kind of presence that made narrow spaces seem to expand around him. Close-cropped gray hair, weathered face marked by years of sun and stress, uniform jacket zipped halfway up over a chest that held more than standard airline wings. She saw them immediately: silver pilot's wings, regulation standard, but above them a small gold pin that most civilians wouldn't recognize, a SEAL trident. He scanned the cabin like he was reading intelligence reports, sharp eyes, cataloging faces, posture, stress indicators, looking for something specific among 200 frightened passengers. His voice cut through the murmurs without amplification. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Captain Holden. We're experiencing a cascade failure in multiple control systems. I need to ask one very specific question, and I need an honest answer." A pause that stretched like held breath. "Is there a combat pilot on board?" Silence. Nobody moved. Even the Navy officers, who had been so vocal about their expertise earlier, sat frozen. One started to raise his hand, then stopped, uncertainty flickering across his face. The SEAL captain waited, patient, professional, but time was a resource they couldn't afford to waste. That's when she stood up, not dramatically, not for effect, just a quiet, deliberate movement from seat 22C, rising to face the front of the aircraft, while everyone else remained paralyzed by the question they'd been asked. Captain Holden's eyes locked onto her immediately. "Background?" he asked, without preamble. "Army aviation," she replied. "Rotary wing first, then fixed wing developmental testing, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, 5 combat rotations. Most recent assignment was experimental platforms out of Fort Rucker." The words dropped into the cabin like stones into still water. Passengers turned to stare at the quiet woman who hadn't spoken the entire flight. The Navy officers blinked in obvious surprise. "Flight status current. I'm actually traveling for technical consultation on the new UH-72 avionics package. But if your ECAM is throwing cascade errors from conflicting system inputs, I've troubleshot that configuration under combat conditions." Captain Holden didn't hesitate. "Come with me." She stepped into the aisle, moving past rows of passengers who watched her with expressions ranging from hope to disbelief. The businessman who'd sat next to her for hours looked like he was seeing her for the first time. As she reached the front of the cabin, one of the Navy officers found his voice. "Wait, she's not even in uniform. How do we know she's qualified?" The SEAL captain turned, movements sharp enough to cut glass. Chief Warrant Officer Denning holds multiple combat aviation ratings, has logged over 2,000 hours in hostile territory, and flew emergency extractions under blackout conditions. His voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. More importantly, she was the test pilot who identified this exact failure mode during developmental trials last year. He looked back at her. "Isn't that right, Chief?" She met his eyes. "That's correct, sir." "Then, let's go save some lives." The cockpit door closed behind them, leaving the cabin in stunned quiet. Through the small window, passengers could see them settling into positions around the flight controls, their movements quick and purposeful. For the first time since the crisis began, some people allowed themselves to believe they might make it home. The cockpit was chaos, rendered in red and amber light warning indicators covering every available surface like angry Christmas decorations. Alarms competed for attention in frequencies designed to trigger immediate response. The air was thick with heat and tension, the electrical smell stronger here where the source lived behind plastic panels and carbon fiber. Captain Holden slid back into the left seat while his first officer, young, competent-looking but sweating through his collar, continued working through emergency checklists that weren't providing answers. "Lieutenant Harris, meet Chief Warrant Officer Denning," Holden said, gesturing to the jump seat behind them. "She's our backup plan." Harris glanced back, relief and uncertainty warring in his expression. "Ma'am, I've run every checklist we have. Multiple redundant systems failing simultaneously, autopilots completely dark, engine parameters fluctuating, hydraulics showing intermittent pressure loss." She strapped into the observer seat, 4-point harness tight across her chest, and immediately began scanning the instrument array with systematic efficiency, not reading individual gauges, but looking for patterns, relationships between failing systems that told stories about root causes. "Your port engine temperature sensor is feeding false data," she said after a moment of analysis. "It's showing thermal stress that isn't there. If you throttle back based on those readings, you'll starve the engine and lose it completely." Harris blinked. "How can you tell?" "Because the exhaust pattern I observed from the cabin doesn't match these temperature readings. Also, vibration frequency is wrong for thermal stress. This is electrical interference masquerading as mechanical failure." Holden's hand moved immediately to the throttle controls, making minute adjustments. The port engine's irregular rhythm smoothed out, still not perfect, but no longer threatening to quit entirely. "Outstanding. What else?" She leaned forward, eyes moving across displays with the trained efficiency of someone who diagnosed mechanical problems where wrong answers got people killed. "Your hydraulic leak isn't where your computer thinks it island. You've got a crossfeed valve stuck partially open, bleeding pressure into the wrong circuit. Manual override through the auxiliary system will stabilize rudder control." "Do it," Holden ordered. Harris followed her guidance, hands moving across overhead switches with growing confidence. Hydraulic pressure stabilized, rudder response smoothed out, and for the first time in minutes, the aircraft felt controlled rather than barely contained. "Jesus," Harris muttered. "How did you know?" "Because I patched this exact failure configuration in a C-130 over the Hindu Kush," she said simply. "Different airframe, same fundamental physics. Metal and electrons work the same way whether you're over Afghanistan or the Atlantic." Through the windscreen, they could see storm clouds building like mountain ranges, lightning splitting the sky in jagged forks that painted the cockpit in brief electric blue weather that would challenge a perfectly functioning aircraft, let alone one held together by improvisation and expertise. Captain Holden turned to look at her directly. "Chief, you're not leaving this cockpit until we're on the ground. Clear?" "Yes, sir." The next hour became a rhythm of crisis and correction. She identified fuel flow imbalances the computer had missed, recalibrated navigation sensors when electronics gave conflicting readings, and provided running commentary on mechanical stress patterns that kept them ahead of failures before they became catastrophic. But through it all, she could feel the aircraft fighting against problems bigger than any individual system malfunction. This was the kind of emergency aerospace engineers designed redundant systems to prevent multiple critical failures happening simultaneously, creating conditions no single procedure could address. The decision came without debate. Keflavik Air Base, Iceland, Holden announced. Military installation, longer runway, crash equipment on standby. 90 minutes of flying time with one engine running rough, hydraulics held together by technical improvisation, and storm clouds that looked like they'd been designed by someone having nightmares about aviation disasters. She kept her eyes moving between instruments and weather outside, calling adjustments in steady streams. Engine parameters steady. Don't chase the fluctuations. Feed auxiliary hydraulics now. We've got maybe 15 minutes before that crossfeed valve fails completely. Turbulence hit them like a physical assault, dropping the aircraft hard enough to slam everyone against restraints. In the cabin behind them, overhead bins rattled, and sounds of genuine terror rose above mechanical noise. "Hold her steady," Harris shouted as the control yoke bucked against his hands. Holden's voice cut through the chaos. "Easy. Don't fight the weather. Work with it. Chief, talk to me." She felt the aircraft struggling beneath them, read stress patterns in how the airframe responded to each gust. This was flying she'd experienced in military transports over mountain ranges where weather killed faster than enemy fire. Left engines not giving consistent power. That's why she's fighting. Compensate 2 degrees right. Bleed pressure to auxiliary systems. Don't try to muscle through turbulence. Let her flex. She's built for this. Holden followed her guidance, hands light on controls, working with the aircraft instead of against it. The plane steadied, still bucking but no longer threatening to tear itself apart. Through breaks in the storm, they caught glimpses of the Icelandic coast, rocky, barren landscapes, swept by winds that could strip paint from metal. Runway lights at Keflavik appeared and disappeared behind curtains of rain. Gear down, Holden ordered. The hydraulics groaned in protest, warning lights flaring across the panel. Her hands shot to manual override switches, systems not responding normally. You'll have to drop on gravity assist, not hydraulic pressure. Landing gear clunked into position with sounds that suggested it was barely holding together. 3 green lights confirmed lockdown, but pressure readings looked like something from a diagnostic nightmare. Outside the windscreen, the runway rushed toward them through sheets of rain that made visibility nearly zero. Approach lights strobed past like tracers marking their descent toward solid ground that seemed impossibly far away. This is going to be rough, Holden warned. Impact came like controlled violence. The aircraft slammed into concrete with sounds that seemed to shake the world. They bounced once, hard enough to lift everyone against restraints, before wheels bit down and held. Smoke poured from brakes as reverse thrust screamed, and the entire airframe shuddered with the controlled brutality of an emergency landing. The plane slowed gradually, fighting momentum and crosswinds, until finally it ground to a complete stop in the middle of the rain-soaked runway. For 10 seconds, the only sound was the tick of cooling metal and the drum of rain against aluminum skin. Then the cabin erupted in applause, sobbing, and laughter that sounded like hysteria but felt like rebirth. They were alive, all of them. Captain Holden reached over and shut down the engines with deliberate finality. In the sudden quiet, he turned to look at her, rain streaking the windscreen behind him. "Chief Warrant Officer," he said, voice carrying weight no regulation could define. "That landing goes in your logbook, too." She held his gaze and nodded once. There was nothing else that needed saying. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft within minutes, but the crisis was over. What remained was aftermath. People realizing they were safe, understanding they'd been closer to disaster than they'd known, processing their own survival in ways that would take days to fully comprehend. The cabin door opened to cold Icelandic air that carried the smell of rain and aviation fuel and the indefinable scent of safety. Passengers moved slowly down the stairs, many stopping to look back at the aircraft that had carried them through impossible conditions. She emerged into the chaos of flashing lights and shouted instructions, rain soaking through her sweatshirt within seconds. Behind her, other passengers followed, some weeping, some laughing, all of them marked by the knowledge of what they had just survived. At the bottom of the stairs, Captain Holden was waiting. Without hesitation, in full view of passengers, emergency personnel, and ground crews conducting organized chaos around them, he came to attention and rendered a sharp, deliberate salute. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't protocol. It was recognition from one professional to another, acknowledgement of competence demonstrated under pressure when everything else had failed. The gesture cut through noise and confusion like a signal flare. Ground crew members stopped their work. Passengers turned to watch. Emergency responders paused in their duties to witness something they didn't fully understand but recognized as important. She returned the salute with equal precision, water dripping from her hair, movements carrying 12 years of military training that had prepared her for moments exactly like this. Nearby, the 2 Navy officers stood apart from other passengers, both soaked and shivering, watching an exchange that reframed everything they thought they understood about competence and worth. The louder one, who had made the jokes about wannabes and admin clerks, looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. His face was pale, eyes wide with the kind of dawning horror that came from realizing exactly how badly he'd misjudged someone. His companion elbowed him, whispered something urgent. They both knew they'd witnessed something they'd never forget, and that everyone around them had witnessed their earlier behavior. A few passengers had started to put pieces together. The businessman who had sat next to her for hours was shaking his head slowly, muttering, "Jesus Christ, she saved us all." The elderly woman from row 19 walked over to them, her voice carrying clearly in the rain. "You boys ought to be ashamed of yourselves," she said, not loudly, but with the kind of steel-backed authority that cut through excuses. "That young woman just risked her life to save yours, and you spent the flight talking about her like she was nothing." The louder officer opened his mouth, then closed it. No words came. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he hadn't known? That if he'd known she was the real deal, he would have treated her with respect? All of those responses just made it worse. The quieter one managed to catch her eye as she shouldered her backpack, his face flushed with shame. He gave a stiff nod, not quite an apology, but acknowledgement, recognition of what he'd failed to see. But she didn't linger on them. Apologies from people who'd revealed their character weren't necessary. They'd learned something about themselves tonight, about the assumptions they carried and the damage they could do with careless words. That lesson would stay with them longer than any exchange of words. Dignity restored itself without requiring validation from those who tried to diminish it. She shouldered her canvas backpack, water streaming from its sides, and began walking toward terminal lights that promised warmth and dry clothes, and all the ordinary comforts that felt miraculous after hours of wondering whether she'd ever experience them again. Behind her, the aircraft sat quietly in the rain, emergency lights still strobing across its wings. Tomorrow, investigators would examine every system, document every failure, write reports that would become case studies in aviation safety programs. But none of that analysis would capture what really happened during those crucial minutes when theoretical knowledge met practical experience, when years of working with machines under impossible conditions translated into the ability to keep them running, when logic said they should fail. She'd felt the weight of dismissal when those officers mocked her qualifications, carrying it like unnecessary baggage, while men who'd never turned a wrench under fire made jokes about competence they couldn't recognize. But that weight was gone now, dissolved somewhere over the Atlantic between crisis and resolution. Because in the end, when metal screamed and systems failed and 200 lives hung in the balance, there had been no question about who belonged in that cockpit. She'd earned her place there the same way she'd earned everything else, through willingness to know her job completely and do it without asking for recognition. The terminal building grew larger through rain and wind, windows glowing with the promise of hot coffee and heated air, and all the small comforts that made survival worth celebrating. But as she walked towards safety, she wasn't thinking about vindication or revenge or any of the emotions people expected from someone who'd been publicly dismissed and privately proven essential. She was thinking about the conversation she'd had with dying systems, conducted in the language of hydraulic pressure and electrical resistance and mechanical stress, the moment when failing machines had decided to hold together a little longer because someone knew how to ask in the right way. That dialogue between pilot and aircraft, that was where she belonged, not in first class or economy or any of the social categories people used to decide who mattered. She belonged wherever broken things needed fixing and failing systems needed one more chance to work. And sometimes when the stakes were high enough and the need was great enough, that was exactly where people like Captain Holden looked for her. The story of Chief Warrant Officer Denning, the unassuming woman in seat 22C, carries a powerful lesson about the danger of underestimating others and the quiet strength of competence. Mocked by Navy officers who assumed her silence signaled weakness, Denning proved her worth when crisis struck, using her combat-honed expertise to save a failing aircraft and 200 lives. Her journey teaches us to look beyond appearances and assumptions. True capability often hides in plain sight, in the person who doesn't boast or seek validation but steps up when it matters most. Denning's calm under pressure, her ability to read the aircraft's subtle cues, vibrations, smells, and failing systems came from years of experience in war zones, not from loud declarations. This reminds us to value substance over show, to respect the quiet heroes whose skills shine in moments of truth. In our lives, we encounter people like Denning, overlooked, underestimated, yet indispensable. Let's challenge ourselves to see beyond first impressions, to recognize that the person we dismiss might hold the key to salvation. Her story also speaks to resilience. Despite ridicule, she focused on the task, letting her actions silence the doubters. Embrace your unique strengths, and don't let others' judgments dim your purpose. What lessons have you learned from being underestimated or witnessing quiet competence? Share your stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you've seen hidden heroes rise. If Denning's tale inspires you to rethink assumptions, hit that subscribe button and join our community for more stories of unsung courage. Let's celebrate those who prove their worth when it counts.